Hi everybody, welcome back. So today I want to talk a little bit about blood chemistry and what happens when we breathe, okay? Let's just go back to the basics of biology, okay? We have certain breathing muscles, body mechanics of breathing, don't we? So our main breathing muscles, what are they? Okay, our main breathing muscle in our body is our diaphragm, which is sitting right here, our main diaphragm, okay? And when we take a nice big breath in, this diaphragm goes like this, from being contracted to opening down, and this is kind of causing a vacuum. And you can see when a vacuum goes like this oxygen drops with it. So the breathing muscle, the diaphragm, is the one muscle that goes like this and helps us to breathe. All right, so let's take a moment and just feel our diaphragm and take a nice big breath into it. And you'll feel your belly goes out. Remember, that's the second chamber. Okay, and that's just this vacuum being created to pull the air down into the lungs. Okay. We also have two other diaphragms in the body. First one being down here in the pelvic bowl. So we'll hear it a lot to squeeze the pelvic floor and pull the energy up. What we're doing is squeezing that diaphragm, right? So if it's open, it's like this. When we squeeze it, it goes like this. And it's pushing, literally, the muscles are allowing the energy to go straight up. Okay. However, when we breathe in deeply, we want to relax this diaphragm, don't we? We want to allow it to go like this. So take a moment, and that's that first chamber of breath, and just allow that diaphragm down here to open fully. Okay, and then exhale. And squeeze the pelvic floor at the very bottom of the exhale. Squeeze all that stale air out. Inhale. Relax both diaphragms, this one and this one. And then exhale. Squeeze them both a little bit at the bottom, just to let that stale air get released completely. Exhale. Okay. So those two diaphragms are very, very important when we're breathing to keep relaxed from a biomechanical perspective. The third diaphragm is in the throat. We don't use it that much unless we're doing a hold to hold energy in and to do something energetic, which we'll talk about that later. But those secondary breathing muscles are, of course, some of these serratus muscles on the sides of your ribs right here that expand and contract to open up the rib cage. Okay, intercostal muscles, the ones between the ribs, of course. Those are secondary breathing muscles, and also the scalenes. So these are these muscles in our neck here that come down and they help to raise the ribs up. So let's just say that somebody is not using their diaphragm and they are using only these secondary muscles. They're going like this. And you're taking shallow breaths, up into the upper chest, not the lower belly. So you can see that this action is going to give people major headaches and major problems because they're not the main muscles for breath. Okay, so if you have major headaches, if you have tight shoulders, if you have curled shoulders, the odds are that you're probably breathing with those muscles. Okay, so that's Biomechanics 101. Biochemistry 101. So when we take a breath, we are taking air from our atmosphere, which is made up of about 77 to 78% nitrogen, about 21% oxygen, and then some excess trace chemicals, trace air. And we're taking that into our mouth or nose, and we're taking it down through the trachea into the bronchioles and eventually into the alveoli, which are these little pockets in the lungs. Okay, and these are 1 cell thick, and when you take a deep breath, the air that you're breathing in, your oxygen, is going to be moving through those alveoli into the bloodstream. Okay, this is a process that happens through diffusion. So with diffusion, there needs to be a gradient in order for it to work. So hence, when we don't have any air in our bloodstream and we take a deep breath, gradient is magnetically pulling the oxygen into the blood. Okay, same thing happens with an exhale. We have a lot of CO2 in our blood and none in our lungs, and so when the CO2 comes to the alveoli, we exhale and off-gas it, okay, because of that gradient. All right, so the oxygen we breathe in goes in through the alveoli and gets dispersed into the blood. And in the blood, it's connected to something called the hemoglobin, okay, which are little red blood cells, proteins on the red blood cell. And those travel all around the body in the blood, delivering oxygen to wherever it's needed, which is everywhere. Okay. When it gets to where it's needed, there's something that's very interesting that happens. So carbon dioxide is often thought of as just this off-gassing chemical, but it's actually essential for oxygen delivery to your muscles, to your bones, to your brain, and everything in the body to work and function. So CO2 is what I call the chaperone of the oxygen. The oxygen gets to where it needs to go. The CO2 that's still remaining in the blood, because there's always a little bit, will take that oxygen molecule and kind of chaperone it into the brain or into this cell or into this cell. Okay, so it can be used for cellular respiration to make ATP essentially, okay, to make energy. And then the point is that we need CO2, a little bit of it in our blood. And the Bohr effect states that without CO2 in the blood, the oxygen cannot uncouple from the hemoglobin, okay, it cannot be delivered into the body. So it's two types of things we talk about in breath work. One is called, well, three actually. One is called hypoxia, and hypoxia is a state of not having enough oxygen in your body, and that is when we get to be about 45% or less of oxygen. And when we get to be about that state, there's risk of passing out. Okay, there's risk of the brain just saying, nope, there's not enough oxygen, I'm shutting down to protect myself, and so the body will pass out. Hypoxia. Okay. We also have a couple words called hyper and hypocapnia. Capnia meaning CO2. Okay, so if the body is hypocapnic, it doesn't have very much CO2. It's low in CO2. Okay, so when it's low in CO2, you're not going to uncouple that oxygen as easily, and it won't be delivered as easily to the body. Okay, how do we do that? How do we get hypocapnic? Well, we breathe out too much. Okay, we off-gas too much CO2, and the blood becomes more alkaline instead of balanced or even a little bit acidic. Okay, so that's when the blood becomes too alkaline, we can't uncouple and we don't get the oxygen delivered. Okay, another thing CO2 does in the body is a vasodilator. So when we have CO2 present in the blood, it opens the blood vessels and it allows the oxygen to be delivered. Okay, so if we have less CO2, those oxygen transport capillaries are going to be narrow. They're going to be vasoconstricted. Okay, so that's why when we breathe, we might get some feelings of tetany, which is when you have that lobster claw feeling, or real tingly around the lips or in the outer extremities of the body. Okay, you also might feel kind of flighty or kind of like you're on some psychedelics or something. You feel kind of woo. That's because your brain is literally getting vasoconstricted. These parts of the body are shrinking their capillaries because the CO2 is not present. All right, and it's not unhealthy to do. It's actually very healthy to do in some systems of psychic development, of psychotropic breath work, holotropic breath work, but we have to understand the chemistry. Okay, when you're hypocapnic, you're not getting oxygen to those places, so you can't do it indefinitely. Okay. In regards to hypercapnia, when we have a lot of CO2 in the blood, say we're doing a breath hold, it causes the blood to become more acidic. Okay, CO2 is an acidifying chemical in the blood. And that's why the Bohr effect works actually, because the blood changes acid, the pH changes, and that's what uncouples the oxygen for you so it can be delivered. Okay, but when we have a lot of CO2 in the blood, we start to have some symptoms, okay? We have symptoms of wanting to swallow. We have symptoms of panic because CO2 is this chemical that tells us we need oxygen. It's the main kick in the pants that says you need to breathe. So you might feel this urge to breathe when there's CO2 high in your blood. Okay, you might have the thoughts of I'm dying, I'm stressed, I don't like this. You might have this feeling of contraction or suffocation. Even if you're holding a full breath of air in and that CO2 is high, you still might feel like you're getting swallowed by something. You might feel that spasms start to happen in your diaphragm because your autonomic nervous system is trying to get you to take a breath. It's an automatic response, okay? And you might just feel very hot, okay, because your capillaries are expanding and you're getting more blood or more oxygen, more blood moving because the capillaries are dilated. Okay, so those are some symptoms of hypercapnia, okay? So that can happen during breath holds. And when we do breath hold practices, say if you're doing a practice of death practice or you're training to do free diving or something like that, we get really good at being comfortable with more CO2 in our blood. And how do we do that? Okay, CO2 is measured in the blood by chemoreceptors that are in the brain stem and also in the aortic arch of the heart. They constantly keep track of the pH of the blood. So when our CO2 rises, that's kind of the thing that tells you you need to breathe, okay? So as we practice being more hypercapnic, what we do is we start to turn down the dial on those chemoreceptors that tell us to be so sensitive to CO2. So if you're at 10 sensitivity, you might move down to like a 3 or a 4, and that's actually very healthy for you. okay, because your body's not needing to take so much air in so regularly in order to breathe. And you can actually use your oxygen that you take in more efficiently, because again, more CO2 tolerance means you're going to really maximize the breath that you do take in and get it delivered properly. Okay, so when you have a really strong CO2 tolerance, your heart beats less, your heart rate is lower. Okay, you don't have to hyper breathe, and in the long term, it's great for longevity. Okay, it's sports performance practice, we call it, really training those CO2 receptors to be strong, where you can hike up a mountain and maybe take 6 breaths a minute through your nose instead of gasping for air through your mouth. Another chemical that we talk about with breath work is nitric oxide. So nitric oxide is made primarily in these little glands inside the nose. And so when we take a breath through the nose, we're getting this beautiful nitric oxide, which sterilizes the air. It God does so many things. I won't be able to remember all of them right now, but it sterilizes the air, okay? It is a vasodilator, so it helps you get more oxygen in for purifying the blood vessels. And it's also really good for telling the lungs to disperse the oxygen everywhere. Usually when we breathe, we might just breathe through the lower lungs, and this is where the oxygen really sits because its depth and its gravity kind of making more blood here. As we breathe through our nose, this dispersion of oxygen can happen in the full lung. Okay, so those are just a few things that are good for you when you breathe through your nose. When you breathe through your nose, you'll notice that you're taking in less oxygen than when you would with your mouth. So you're naturally training your chemoreceptors to be stronger with their CO2 tolerance. Okay, to be less sensitive in a sense. Okay, so those are just some things about blood chemistry that might happen, and also biomechanics of the body. Okay, so as we get into breath work, you're going to notice that these things are going to be tweaked so that we can create different environments for practice. Okay, thank you very much. See you next time. Bye.